Hey guys, Mark here. Welcome to my video on string methods, going over a basic overview of many of the string methods you may find on exams, or just the main overview of the ones that I would say you need to know or should know, and some of the confusion that you may not be getting clarification of. So let's get started. Um, what we have here is we have our main, we have a string that's named one and it's equal to hey guys. And then two is the name and it's mark here. And then three is just an empty space. We have a character that we declared and it's empty. And we have an int count upper and an index 0. Those are just initialized variables and we'll see what we'll do with them. So we have our first one, which is dot length. This is the method, and you can usually be able to distinguish methods because methods are lowercase, classes are uppercase, and methods usually have a period that come before them. So this method doesn't need to take any parameters, so that's why it's empty. So don't forget those parentheses, very important. And what the length does is it does something very simple. And if you've worked with arrays, you probably know about this method. And it returns an integer. That's the return type. It returns an integer of the length. So it goes through and it counts all of the elements in the string one and it returns the length. If we printed out length of one, it would print out every single spot in here, including white spaces. And we can test that out if we want to, but let's just continue going through. We have another variable that was 3 before, and it's showing off the method, the string method called concat, which does something very similar, relatively identical to the plus operator with strings, which is concatenation. So 3 would be the addition of that string to that string. And then we're going to move on to equals ignore case. And I show the ignore case one because that comes up on exams and questions more frequently than not. You can just do the equals without the ignore case, but with the equals ignore case, it checks the value of the letters and it says, is this the same word as that? And it's going to be Boolean. And instead of using a string that you can declare, that you don't need to declare in there, but you can define in there. For example, we have hey in this parameter argument. I'm mixing those up right now. Um, it'll test against hey, but we can very well go along and change this to we can do two, or we can do two instead, and we can test it against two. And it'll test the variable two. It'll point to this. It'll say, okay, so is one equal to ignoring the case to 2. In this case, it would return false. And we can prove that to you really quickly because I have a feeling that you would want to see that because I would want to see at least one of these. I'd be like, what is this? Who's this person saying stuff? And we'd have to get rid of this. So let's see. See, it's false because they're not equal to, ignoring the cases. And let's move on to our next method. Our next method is called compare to. And this one is not going to be a Boolean method. And this is one of the, I believe there are a handful of them, but this is a really important one. But this one is going to return a equals to, is greater than, or less than. And it's going to return less than 0, like an actual integer, less than 0, if 1, in this case, the string 1, is less than the compared integer, that's 2, dictionary-wise. So ABC is going to be less than XYZ, because I believe it takes the hex, not the hex, it takes the Unicode values. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the important basic thing to understand is that it takes the alphabetized letters and whichever ones of the sum or the sum of A, B, and C numerically versus the sum of X, Y, and Z numerically. And if 1 in this case is A, B, and C, and 2 is X, Y, and Z, 1 is going to be less than the 1 is going to be less than 2. These are variables, remember that. Then it's going to return a negative number. And then if we have it flipped the opposite way, that 1 is equal to the string X, Y, and Z, and 2 is equal to the letters A, B, and C, then it's going to be greater than 0, which means that the string 1 is in a comparative way larger than string 2 in those dictionary to number value wise, which is not the same as letters, but that would be a more in-depth video. And if it is 0 that's being returned or printed out, the integer, then it has the same value, which can get a little bit tricky. So you can have A, B, and C, and A, B, and C would be a little bit easier. A place that you'd have to do a little more poking around, and I'd probably have to devote a video to, would be the different scenarios of what if you have one that's a longer string, one that's a shorter, but in numeric value, they are equal. And that's something you should be looking out for a video of. And if you want to get into that, go Google it so you can clarify. But this is the basic functionality of that. Moving on to the index of method, we're going to take the string 1 and we're going to invoke the method index of, which is going to take 2 parameters, right? Now, the first one is a string. Again, you could use a variable instead of the actual declared string. And then the second one, which is optional, you don't need the second parameter. But the second parameter says, starting from the index of 5, tell me the index of the string guy. So it returns the position of the first occurrence, string guy, but starting from index 5. If we got rid of index 5, we would just have, it would give us the first, it would give us the index of the first occurrence of that string GUY in the string 1, and it's going to return that index. And if it doesn't have the index, I believe the default return is -1, but don't quote me on that. And one thing to point out here is just something that you may heard of and you may not understand yet, that this is method overloading. Some methods, they can be defined and used with 1 parameter, 2 parameter, and that's something you'll see as you get more advanced. Let's move on to the next method. This one's called substring. Similarly, you don't need both of these. You do not need both of these parameters, but you can use them, and they're really important and somewhat confusing. I found it hard to figure out the information of this until I went into my book and read about it. So essentially, when you do use 2 parameters, the first one is going to be starting at the position. So 1.substring starting at position, which is the index, starting at index 4, going, and then the second one going up until exclusive. Exclusive, so not including the 8th element, but up until the 8th element. So including the 4th index up until the 8th index, get that substring, right? And essentially, the way you would use this in a more practical way is you would create a new string thing is equal to that. Let's just clear the board. And then you can do, let's do system out, and let's do thing. And it should give us the substring of, yeah, AG. And if you see, that's from index 4, so that's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have inclusive E. We have the Y, so from 4 to 5, 5 to 6, 6 to 7, 7 to 8. And 8 would be the U, but 7 is G. So that's correct. We can start at the 4th element, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the 4th element, this is the 5th element, this is the 6th element, this is the 7th element, and that's the last one that's included. And U would be the 8th element, as you can see, is not being printed out. All right, let's move on. We're going to show this very simple one. The dot trim just takes away all the spaces. Feel free to mess around with that. And then one really important one is the to lowercase. It takes the string and it turns it into lowercase. And I don't think you need parameters for this one either, although it looks like you do have possibility for them, but that's beyond my scope of knowledge, beyond the scope of knowledge that I believe you would probably need watching this video. But nonetheless, that is the basics of all of the string methods that are going to be expected of you relatively early on. There are a lot of them, and I'd recommend that if you have more questions regarding them, you check out the documentation. Just Google it, Oracle, Java, string methods, and you should be able to find the documentation. And if you have any questions, please feel free to comment below. I will do my very best to respond to every single comment, as well as leaving a thumbs up or a thumbs down. I try to go through this information relatively quick, um, at the same time while being thorough, and I hope that's not too confusing, but please leave me the feedback because I found myself watching a lot of videos where people would show you what they're doing, but they wouldn't explain some basic ones. And when you're starting, if you don't understand, um, if people don't iterate that this is a method because it's lowercase and one is the name of the string, then it's really easy to get lost and you have to watch the video 7 times, or you just watch it twice and you get frustrated and you just go on to the next question without really understanding it. So I hope it serves a purpose for you, and I'd love your feedback on that. At the same time, I really value videos that are short, and that's why I work to keep them as short as possible. Speaking of which, I'm going to cut myself off.